So I'm pushing downward slightly, that's my intent. He's leaning back, that's a double intent, so he's pulling away from that same fixed point. He's also breathing. So my fingers are going right into the diaphragm, allowing the diaphragm to descend as it expands, and do that 2 or 3 times, and then make a re-evaluation of that. And so now that's freed that off. So the greater part of the stomach, the fundus, is above this line here. So that could have been tight along the coronal plane or tight from a shoulder condition. That's going to free off the rib cage itself. And then I'm going to lay him down. And I want to evaluate now the springiness. So this can be done 2 ways. One with a straight hand straight down the sternum. And you're pressing down, and that should displace really quite easy. You can see how springy Paul's rib cage is there with the movement I can produce. Now, if there was a lack of movement there, I want to identify which rib is the lack of movement on it. So what you've got here is you've got 7 true ribs. So the first 7 are true. And what that means is that they've got articulations with the vertebra at the back, and they've also got articulations here at the sternum. Now, this doesn't appear to be a movement joint, but it actually has little diarthrodial sacs in there. So they're all true joints. And so again, with the whiplash and the seat restraint coming across diagonally, they can cause restrictions in there, which eventually cause what we call an eggshell effect. So the next time I push against something, the next time I fall on my hands, the next time I have another seatbelt restraint, I can get more problems in there because it's not moving properly. But it's the 3-dimensionality of the breathing that's restricted. Just one rib can affect an organ. Now, the other thing about the ribs is where they come back and articulate with the spine, it can push against a vertebra transverse process and create a subluxation from the rib, which we need to differentiate. It's like we need the rib out the way or it's the subluxation. Now, whichever way it is, if the rib is causing a subluxation, say D5 or 6 or 7, then that nerve is going to cause a vasomotor response to whatever organ it's feeding. So it either gets too much energy or not enough energy. And that's where disease starts. That's the whole concept of chiropractic, is you've got vasomotor disturbance coming from the nerve feeding the organ, or from the organ feeding to the spine and going up to the brain. So that's called a vasomotor disturbance. So anything that's restricted is potentially causing a vasomotor disturbance to that organ. So as we start to move more into organs, then you're going to be able to troubleshoot as to which one, where it's coming from. And that's where the TS line and other indicators are going to help you out. So Paul's is quite good. I'm coming right down to the 10th rib, under the liver. I can get my fingers underneath it. And also what I'm doing, I'll show it on this side. If I wanted to go under the rib further, if I compress the rib cage above this side on the stomach and the spleen side, or this side on the liver side, then what it does, it displaces those organs because of what we call the tergor. So the organs are able to move around different axes of motion. So I can push it down, and I want to see that the fingers underneath the rib cage fill up. So I'm pushing the stomach and the spleen down, I'm pushing the liver down, and it's displacing nicely. So that rib cage is working fine. All of the ribs here, the true joints, are working fine. I come all the way up to the sternum, and I'm going to check on the manubrium. I'm going to press the manubrium right on the junction of the clavicular, sternoclavicular junction. So I'm right here. So I've got a finger right on that junction there, and then I can move the collarbone, the clavicle. Does it spring? And also, it's probably best evaluated better from above, but does it roll superiorly and does it roll inferiorly? And then I can palpate along its length and feel for the subclavius, which comes about 2/3 of the way along from origin to insertion. And I was taught the subclavius muscle many, many years ago, and I realized it was the key to a lot of shoulder problems that people just weren't assessing, because you can't muscle test it. So because there isn't a muscle test for it, it was ignored. But of course, therapy localizes. And so you can go to the origin insertion of the pectoralis, of the subclavius, and check if you've got an involvement there. If you've got an involvement and that isn't working properly, then you know at that stage, above 90 degrees, the clavicle isn't going to rise. It's not going to roll superiorly. So you're going to lose 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 degrees of movement in the shoulder, simply because of one tiny muscle not being able to activate that crank to make the elevation of the shoulder possible. So that's really important. What else are we looking for?
When you're doing that for therapy localized, can you use any arm for your limb? Or
yes,
you use the same one, didn't you?
Yeah. Did I? Yeah, you could use any. So what Paul's asking is, I'm therapy localized in the origin insertion, so I can use any previous intact muscle. I use the same one, so that's okay. Yeah, it's okay. So basically, you're just challenging the origin insertion. If it goes weak, it's not working properly, then I would then strip along its length from the sternum to 2/3 away along the clavicle to see if it's got a facial distress as well. So strip along, hasn't got a facial disturbance. If either of those were present, I want to address that. Then I start to look at the ligaments coming onto the joint itself. Jump you back off for a sec. And then we're looking again at the shoulder itself, this axis of motion. And you need to study these a little bit, because some of these ligaments are accessible to your fingers and some are not. But collectively, when you go into a person's shoulder and you apply a triaxial shimmy, which is done with the body and not just the fingers, then you can start to make all of these ligaments work as one. So the ligaments at rest are just like the closed icosahedron. They're waiting to do something. The second that the ligament is activated, the shoulder or any joint knows it's going to be ready for motion. The muscles then get a signal. This all happens very, very quickly, but I decided to do this with my arm. So the ligaments at rest are omnidirectionally holding the joint in its right axis of motion position. I want to move my arm, so all of these muscles around that center of axis have to co-contract in a gear train to allow whatever action it wants to be, front, back, left, behind, rotate, whatever it's going to do. So then the ligaments are going to fire and allow that stasis of position, that static position, to now move through a range of motion. So you've got muscles at the front, co-contracting muscles at the back, superiorly and inferiorly, all working in that 3-dimension. It's a very complex joint when you think of it in those terms. So when we get hold of the ligaments and the ligaments start to fire, they're going to initiate the movement in the direction that you want to go. Now, if it's inhibited, those ligaments know about it because it's already at rest. The scapula could be sitting too far forward on the scapulothoracic joint, and so it can't glide on my scapula. So the ligaments already know that because they're holding it in adaptation. Now, the muscles only get a message when I'm starting to move. So they start to activate the Golgi cells, the spindle cells. The muscle now moves through its range of motion and shortens and laterally expands to produce the movement, but the ligaments are already aware of that. So if I've got a restriction of movement, then what I want to do is to go to all of those ligaments collectively and start to inhibit different directions. So say the arm wouldn't go above here, then I want to hold all of those ligaments and go, right, is it the latissimus dorsi? Is it the anterior serratus? Is it the subclavius muscles? So I can then go to the tendons of those muscles which are accessible and see if there's strain patterns on there that I can inhibit to make the muscle work properly. So you're going to use the ligaments for a lot of inhibition around there. So you're grabbing the whole of the joint and then seeing if it improves the range of motion. Can you just jump back on, Paul? Might be sitting up probably best. So I'm moving the arm through its range. Now, on the outside of the shoulder, you've got, he's the clavicle, he's the head of the humerus. This is where the biceps tendons coming in, the coracobrachialis, the pectoralis minor. So I've got front of the coracoid process. I can come around the back here and I can get all of the base of the scapula, which is of course pointed. And I can see that if I can squeeze these ligaments here, so I can get the conoid, the trapezoid ligaments, the acromion ligament, the glenoid ligament, you can get at all those ligaments and you're squeezing them individually to see which one is allowing a better scapulohumeral rhythm, a better movement of the scapula on the thorax. So we can use inhibition for that. Now also, if I go under the axilla, right up here, I'm getting probably as high as maybe rib 3. On a good day, you can maybe get as high as rib 2. And the higher up you can get, the better, because there can be rib restrictions going on there. I can also now start to feel the anterior serratus. Now, if the anterior serratus is really pulling and tight, and as I press in, it doesn't move very well, and Paul's is a little tight here, actually. So let's check the anterior serratus muscle. Just lie face up. So I'm taking the arm up, and I'm taking my fingers, and I'm putting them underneath the bottom of the scapula here, to inhibit. So if there's any movement taking place, I know it's not the muscle, it's the joint. And taking the arm above the head, finger on the bottom of the scapula, and then I'm going to pull the arm forward, and actually it's testing strong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a little bit of a stretch the other way, stretch it out, and then test it again. Now it tests weak. That's important. So I felt it as an evaluation that when I was pushing the interosseous spaces here, that the ribs weren't displacing the way I want them to. Now, if the ribs can't displace the way I want them to, when I'm moving the arm, it's not just an arm movement. All of the ribs have to be able to move as well. So again, you can quite often be misled by thinking you've got a shoulder capsule problem, bursitis, rotator cuff minor tears, all the things that they normally would go to physios with, can be actually part of the rib cage, because if the rib cage doesn't move, your spoked wheel isn't working properly. So it's really important. So I picked it up on Paul simply by palpation. We tested the muscle, and we could be led to thinking it's fine, but it's not fine. It's holding itself very strong. So I put a stretch reflex on it. Just stretch it. You can either do it fast or slow. I'm just putting a slow dynamic stretch on it. Going back, testing the integrity of the muscle. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I'm feeling things on that.
Right. Yeah.
That's
so
or shorter, is it, or something like
that? Yeah. As I'm testing that, Paul's pointing to his shoulders. I'm feeling that there. Now, what you've got is any part of that spoke wheel is not transmitting those forces into the soft tissues and the ribs and further down the spine. So what we're looking for is where are the restrictions? So as I'm moving through the muscle tests, that's giving me one idea. As I'm moving through the range tests that I want to do and the palpation tests I want to do, one of the things I've picked up there is the anterior serratus is tight. Now, if it's tight there, it's likely to be tight at the rhomboids, which come around. So you've got your rhomboids here as a facial line. So the rhomboids are here, coming around to become the anterior serratus, and then going across here to the anterior superior iliac spine as a band of fascia. So you can see now that also, if my pelvis is out of alignment, and I've got a posterior ilium or an anterior ilium, depends, doesn't matter which, then the relay station point at the anterior superior iliac spine is now incorrect as a nodal point of correction for the posture. It's now a nodal point of distortion for that, and that can pull across. That could make the liver tight, it can make the opposite shoulder tight, and we've got a shoulder problem coming from a hip. That's why it's important to always put your pelvis in first, so that you know that any facial pulls are separate to the pelvis analogy. So you've got the pelvis in the right place. Now, if I've still got a tension on this band, I can now pandiculate that out, go and retest the muscles. So this is a perfect one. The fact that we've got that stretch test on the anterior serratus, we've got the discomfort coming from the front, but it's underneath, it's pulling incorrectly. I haven't got that scapulohumeral rhythm. So he's getting symptoms at the front, which you could go and get ultrasound on. You think it's a bicipital tendon. It could be other things because of that three-dimensionality. Is that starting to make sense? So what I'm going to do also is test the rhomboids.